All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to YouTube to watch this webinar on adolescent development and the brain. And my name is JP Butler, and I am the outreach coordinator of Safe Shelter of St. Vrain Valley. I do have my master's in educational psychology, and Safe Shelter of St. Vrain Valley is a domestic violence victim services nonprofit organization. For those who may not have seen the prior webinar that we had last week we had a webinar on Teen Dating Violence 101, and what we wanted to do is follow that up with a webinar on what's going on in an adolescent mind, what's going on in the adolescent brain, so that we can be better prepared to talk with our youth and to interact with them. I'm proud to say that I've been working with youth for over 10 years and have been a motivational speaker for 10 years. And I've actually specialized in healthy relationships and prevention education for over 8 years. So it's a pleasure being here and providing this information for you. This video is being taped and will be available on YouTube after the webinar is over, so you can share this with your friends, family, and colleagues if you so choose. Getting right to it, what are we getting out of this? What are we going to be talking about today? I have some objectives for you, and hopefully by the end of this webinar, you will be able to understand different parts of the brain that are key to adolescent development. I hope that you will be able to have a better understanding of what is typical for adolescent development, and that includes what are they concerned about, what are they trying to accomplish, all of those things. And finally, I have one more, and that's we need to connect the dots between our identity, how we relate to other people, and sometimes how these two can come out of order. What you're going to find is that developmentally, one of these has to come before the other. And when you mix those two and they fall out of order, sometimes we run into a little bit of trouble. It doesn't mean that we're in deep trouble, it just means that we may have to think about a few things and definitely help our youth maneuver this very interesting time of life. So just a few last minute things before we get started are just some agreements, just so that you know this webinar is full of information. I don't know if I could have put more into 60 minutes. Because of that, I need you to let me know if I'm going too fast. Let me know how I can clarify what I have said. And the way that you can do that is you can do that by clicking on the link that is in the description of this video. So if you're on YouTube, there is a section where it has the description of the video, and then it will say join the conversation and be able to ask questions, and it has a link that you can click there. You will definitely want to click on that. You will need a Google account, and just to let you know, you will be able to ask questions anonymously. So, and this is for those of us who are joining us live. For those who are watching this webinar after it has been recorded, you are more than welcome to use the contact information at the end of the webinar to ask me questions that you have about this information. And so that's really key, is that I'm always here, always willing to answer your questions over email, over the phone, or even in person if you're close to Safe Shelter of St. Vrain Valley, which is located in Longmont, Colorado, or we can meet in person after the webinar. So I just would like everyone to know that there is about a 20 to 30 second delay between you sending a question and me receiving it. So if you ask a question, please give the servers a few minutes to get that information to me. So, and I will make sure to keep my eye on the questions just in case anyone does have, you know, JP, you're going too fast, or if you do have a question you have about anything that we have in this webinar. So let's go ahead and just get started, get right down to it. And we are going to start with the brain. And the brain is fascinating. My master's has just really opened up a lot of different ways of thinking about how our brain works, and educational psychology really focuses on how we learn. So that's why I would love to share this information with you and to give you some insight into how we learn as humans, which is totally applicable to our adolescent population. So let's go ahead and just get right down to it. And we need to talk about a few parts of the brain in particular, because when we're talking about adolescence, there are a few things that I definitely want to draw our attention to. So let's get started. And the first part that I want to talk about is the thalamus. Now, the thalamus is located just about in the middle of the brain, and the job of the thalamus is that it processes information. Four of your five senses go through the thalamus first before anything else. And so, with that, the only sense that does not go through the thalamus is smell. Smell is processed directly by the rear part of your brain. It does not go through the thalamus, which means what you hear, what you see, what you touch, and what was the other one? What you see, touch, hear. And then the fifth one, everyone's like, it's this, it's this. I'll figure it out in a minute. But your other four senses are processed through the thalamus. It's the gateway. When we think about where that information goes, the next big piece of information that and the next piece, the part of the brain that I want to cover is called the amygdala. It's one of the oddest named parts of the brain, and it's spelled funny, but it's so important. And it's because it is your emotional processor and what we call your emotional sentinel. Meaning, when you are thinking about, like your emotions, when you are trying to understand, your emotions and sort of like happy, sad, angry, frustrated, rage, joy, sorrow, grieving, that's your amygdala. Your amygdala is really activated during those times to be able to identify what you are feeling and how that actually applies to the current situation. So when we think about the amygdala, first thing that always comes to mind is this idea of what's its job. And I kind of went over it, but just so that you can see a very just blunt definition of what its job is to check for stimuli, for any threats, and if it needs to, it will activate our flight, fight, or freeze response. So flight is very much, I need to run away, I'm not safe. The second one is fight, which doesn't necessarily mean physical fighting. It can sometimes just mean defend my position, defend who I am, defend my beliefs. So sometimes that can also mean fight, but it does include physical fighting. If you needed to defend yourself physically, that's your fight response. Or freeze. Freeze means for you to completely shut down. And so that can look like many different things. Maybe you have an argument with someone and all of a sudden they just completely check out. What happens is their amygdala has been triggered to say, I can't do this. I'm too emotional. I feel the frustration. I feel the anger, and I just need to shut down. And so that's what the amygdala does, is that it can activate our flight, fight, or freeze response if needed. And this is what was interesting, is that through my opportunities in education, I learned something really interesting that I would like to share with all of you, which is what triggers the amygdala? What information comes to the amygdala, to your brain, that actually makes your amygdala, for a lack of a better word, kind of freak out and activate the flight, fight, or freeze response? What triggers it? The first one that many people think of first are physical threats and endangerment. If you feel like you are in danger, you need to either run away or stand and defend, and sometimes you even shut down. Sometimes there are traumatic experiences where our brain cannot process what's happening and it will shut down. So when there is a physical threat or endangerment, your amygdala can kick in and will respond with either your flight, fight, or freeze. The second one is what we call incongruences in the environment, or as a better way to put it is like something doesn't look right. So if you have been moving through life and you have been, we are so pattern oriented, and when something comes up that does not match a pattern that your amygdala gets kind of curious. It does activate the flight, fight, or freeze response, because it doesn't know what to do. We seek patterns, and when there's something that comes up that just doesn't make sense to us, our amygdala just it kind of locks up, and it's like, I got to do something. I either need to run away, or I need to, defend myself, or I need to kind of shut down completely, whatever it may be. So those are incongruences. The next one is the unknown, which is interesting to me because I think that for many of us, the unknown can be scary, but the unknown can also be kind of like a thrill, adrenaline. And so when you are experiencing the unknown, I don't know what's going to happen when, we go to this place. I don't know what's going to happen after this event happens. Your amygdala gets triggered. And so when it's trying to deal with the unknown, it tries to figure, it can be triggered. It can say like, oh gosh, like the unknown is so scary. The unknown is, it's too much. So that's the third thing that can trigger the amygdala. Now, this last one, I think, is very important for many reasons. I think it's important for us as adults. I also think it's important for understanding how we interact with youth. The fourth thing that can trigger the amygdala is the shoulds in life. I should, I should be like, I shouldn't have done, you shouldn't have. This is why shoulds trigger your amygdala. They are a natural betrayal of who we are and where we are in this very moment. And what happens is that it can be very shaming. When you think to yourself, I should have done something better. Okay, you may think that. The issue is your brain doesn't comprehend that because it says, but you didn't. So when you say you should have done something, your brain's like, all right, I get it. I get what you're saying, but I can't do anything about it. So what happens, or even when we say something like, I should be better, I should have done more. What you're doing is you're looking at who you are and you're saying that you're not enough, that you didn't do enough, it's very, very shaming. So when we say things like, you should have, you should do this, you should do that, you shouldn't have made that choice, you should have thought more, it's a natural betrayal to what actually happened and who they are. And so that's something that really triggers the amygdala, is that it really goes into that sort of shame area because it's betraying who you are in that moment. And so the reason, like, what I want to do real quick is also introduce the third part of the brain that we're talking about tonight, and that's the prefrontal cortex. We'll come back to how these two things, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, work together, but I definitely want to introduce the prefrontal cortex now. And what this does, this is at the front of your brain. This is your executive function. In other words, it's your CEO. It deals with logic. It deals with critical thinking. And let me give you the list of what it does. It deals with judgment, it deals with reasoning, it deals with planning, it deals with future-oriented thinking of what's going to happen in the future. If I do this, what are the consequences? It's really good at problem solving. It can handle that. It wants to figure out what's the best way to do this. It controls impulses and spontaneity, as opposed to, it likes to think, what will happen if I do this? Impulse can be good, and at times it can inhibit a lot of things. And so your prefrontal cortex is meant to just do a quick check to see if that impulse or that thing that you want to spontaneously do is a good or bad thing. So it's in charge of that control. It's in charge of risk assessment and management. It's in charge of what we perceive as good and bad. So when we think that certain actions, certain beliefs, certain behaviors are good or bad, that is your prefrontal cortex trying to determine what it is. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it this? Is it that? And so it also deals with truth. Your prefrontal cortex is in charge of analyzing information and finding truth in the world. So that's the part of your brain that it's in charge of. It's also in charge of what we call socially acceptable behaviors. It's when you make a rude comment, or that's not socially acceptable. If you do this, it's not socially acceptable. If you stand on someone's furniture, it's not socially acceptable. Your prefrontal cortex holds all that information of what is socially acceptable. And they learn that. We learn throughout life, not just in adolescence, but throughout life, we continue to assess what is and what is not socially acceptable. So our prefrontal cortex handles that. It also crosses emotion with logic. It's an emotional checkpoint. We're going to talk about something that can happen where this checkpoint is not even reached. But for the most part, our prefrontal cortex will check in with all the information. It listens to the amygdala. It says, okay, I hear you. I hear that there's an emotional response, but let's think about this logically. So that's what it's in charge of. So it does a lot. The prefrontal cortex does a lot. And we're going to learn this here in a minute, but they do not develop at the same time. Your amygdala and your prefrontal cortex do not develop at the same time. Your amygdala, your emotional control house, develops sooner. So let me tell you this one thing that can happen, and this happens for adults as well. It happens for adults, it happens for youth, is there's a connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. What I want to ask you is, have you ever been in a conversation with someone and all of a sudden you say something that makes them fly off the handle and become very emotional? There's a typo there, but something that makes them fly off the handle and become very emotional. Have you ever had an experience like that? We call this, you have just experienced an amygdala hijack. Because let me show you something. Let me put all three of those parts of the brain together. Your amygdala receives information a split second faster because it's closer to the thalamus. So when your body receives a stimulus, it will reach the amygdala quicker. So if your amygdala is triggered, it can shut down everything else that your brain wants to tell you. And this is why. So if your brain activates its flight, fight, or freeze response, it becomes significantly harder for logic to intrude because your brain is trying to protect itself. It's trying to say, like, we need to do something and we need to do something now. Your logical, your prefrontal cortex wants to sit there and say, okay, well, let's look at the information. Your amygdala says, no, we don't have time. So it becomes significantly harder for logic and your prefrontal cortex to intrude if the amygdala has activated the flight, fight, or freeze response. So if you're in a conversation with a youth and they fly off the handle and become super emotional with you, you may have just experienced an amygdala hijack. They may have become very defensive or shut down, or they just want to leave. Like you may be talking to a youth and the conversation triggers them to be like, I'm out of here. And so you may have experienced an amygdala hijack where the amygdala has just said, I'm done, I have to go, and there's no sense of logic coming from the rest of the regions of the brain. So here's something to remember. When a conversation triggers a hijack, you can do one of two things. You can either de-escalate the tension through dialogue, apologizing, validating, like, I hear that you're frustrated. I'm so sorry that I said that completely the wrong way. Can I reword that? So you de-escalate the tension through dialogue, or you shelf the conversation for another time. You say, we're both heated. I can see that, we've triggered each other. We're emotional. So we just need to maybe take some time, maybe 15, 30 minutes. Maybe we talk about it tomorrow. But I'm going to go ahead and say that I think that we need to spend some time and space away from one another. And that's what happens when you have a hijack. You may want to do one of those two things, either talk it out or just say, maybe it's best if we save this for another time. And that's super important when it comes to talking with our youth, is knowing that if they get hijacked, if they have an amygdala hijack, that we have to either de-escalate it or say, all right, I can see that we're heated. I'm going to go ahead and just recommend that we move beyond, that we, we save this for another time. So kind of big picture, what's the point of all of this? Your amygdala, this is what I was saying a little bit earlier, is that your amygdala, your emotional processor, matures faster than your prefrontal cortex. So what that results in is when you have a mature amygdala and a maturing prefrontal cortex, emotions rule, and in parentheses, that's super important. Emotions will rule if they don't have emotional control and regulation. Youth can learn emotional control and regulation. They can. It's just a little bit more difficult for them. So it's not impossible at all. And we can help them do that as adults by modeling emotional control and regulation. We can do that by what I said as, let's go ahead and I see that our emotions are really high right now. Let's go ahead and just come back to this conversation about 15 minutes. What's happening is you're giving them an opportunity to learn how to deal with the emotional part and come back to a conversation where it is based off of what is reasonable in this conversation, what sounds right. And the one thing that we know is that the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until about 25. That's why you hear individuals saying that adolescence does not end until 25. It's because your brain is not fully developed. When your brain gets to 25, and there is some, it's not like happy birthday, you're 25. Oh, your brain stopped developing. It can happen a little bit sooner, a little bit later, but on average, our prefrontal cortex in our brain is fully developed around 25. So that's something to really remember. And even after the amygdala matures, even after that, you still have to remember that your brain will send information out. Your thalamus will be like, here's the information. And your amygdala will receive information a split second quicker than your cortex. So in general, what that means is that we generally have an emotional reaction quicker than we have a logical reaction. And gosh, I look at my past 10 years, and it's so true when it comes to adolescence. It's not even a curse. It's just more of the way that it is. And they are so, I will say this, they're in tune with their emotions, even if they don't know how to name it. So their brain's working, their brain is processing, their brain is trying to comprehend what's going on. And the amygdala is pretty mature. So they're feeling it. They just may not know how to name it. They may not know this is frustration, this is dread, this is joy, this is excitement, this is fear. They may not know that, but we typically have that emotional reaction a lot quicker than our logical reaction. So, some takeaways for this section before we move on to the next. Just remember that your emotional processor matures faster than your logical. We generally have that emotional reaction faster than our logical. Now, our emotional processor development starts at a very young age. Your logical processor starts really developing right before puberty. So your emotional processor, your amygdala, is already trucking away, and your logical processor isn't there yet. So you have to remember that when we're working with youth, when we're working with children, when you're working with your child, is that their brain's in a different space. Doesn't mean they can't comprehend, doesn't mean they can't control their emotions. It's just an important part to remember when it comes to conversing with them. Last, just remember that your emotional processor can mature as early as puberty, but your logical processor isn't fully developed until you're 25. So now, having said all this, that is a crash course. I'm looking at my clock, and that was about 20 minutes of a crash course on your thalamus, your amygdala, and your prefrontal cortex. And again, any questions can be directed to me if you have questions about the brain. But what I want to do now is, this is about adolescent development and the brain, and that's the next section that I want to move into. This is what I will say. Even as a youth service provider, I love looking at theories when it comes to how people develop, how adolescents develop, what their theories are. But the one thing that I know for sure is that I take them all with a grain of salt. I think to myself, this is a great framework. It's a great way to at least understand the concept without saying this is absolute truth. So when we talk about these stages of development, I would like for you to do the same thing. That this is just a great way to kind of initiate conversation and just get our brains thinking. This is not the this is not the, wow, this is the answer to everything. I just would like to present to you this information so that it can kind of enrich your experience when working with youth. And the person that I use for this part is Erickson. His name is Erik Erikson, and he produced 8 developmental steps of psychosocial development. Long words. However, it just means birth to death in 8 developmental steps. So he really broke it down for us, and I'm going to present that to you tonight. The other thing that I will tell you is that a copy of the slides can be found in the description of this video. So you will have all this information if you're typing or writing notes or things like that. All of this information is available as a PDF, and you can click on that by looking in the description of this video. So let's get started with Erickson. Erickson broke it up into 8 stages. The first stage that he, for his theory, this is what he found, is about between the ages of 0 and 2. You really are trying to figure out what he calls trust versus mistrust. And this is super interesting. I've had so many students try to put these 8 stages into order, and they never think that this is first. And I'll tell you why it's first. The goal of this stage is to learn to trust others in the world. And you know how they do it? They do it by attempting to communicate, which is most times crying, because they're 0 to 2. I mean, if they started talking to us, I would be a little concerned. But they cry, and if their needs are met, then they trust the world. They say, I'm hungry. They communicate it by crying. We give them food, so then I trust the world. They have no concept of people yet. They have concept of is there something out there I'm trying to communicate with you because I'm hungry? Or there's something out there I'm trying to communicate because I'm in pain. So what happens is that they take that, and a 0 to 2-year-old takes that information in as trust the world, because you have needs, and the world can help you meet your needs. Now, the consequence if that's not met is that you have the potential for them to form trust issues. Now, we can form trust issues at any point in our life. That is 100% true. But it's also true for 0 to 2-year-olds, which sounds interesting because trust is such an abstract concept. It's, do I trust you? An infant, a 6-month-old doesn't sit there and say like, oh, do I trust this? But what's interesting is that the brain processes it like that. That if I don't get my needs met, who do I trust? Who do I trust to help me figure this out? Now, the next stage happens between 2 and 4, and we call it the autonomy stage. And in autonomy, you're either going to become autonomous or you're going to have shame and doubt. Generally, this is between 2 and 4, the ages of 2 to 4. Your goal is that you need to gain a sense of independence and control of my physical skills. Now, here's the method. Try. If I fail, try again. And then keep trying. Now, what's interesting is that this is potty training. So what they want is they want to know that they can do things by themselves. This is also between 2 and 4. They may even start trying to put their own clothes on. What they're trying to do is gain a sense of, I can do this. I can go to the bathroom. I can dress myself. I can do this. I can do that. And so they try. And if they fail, they try again. And they keep trying. But then, of course, there comes a point where that only goes so far. The consequence is, if I believe I have failed or I've been told that I have failed, I will experience shame and doubt. So sometimes there are individuals who have so much push, so much, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And if they believe they have failed, they may form feelings of shame and doubt. Or if their caregiver has told them that they failed, that may also create shame and doubt. So that's an important stage of development between the ages of 2 and 4. Moving on between 4 and 5, this is where we talk about initiative. I swear I'm getting to adolescence, but I always enjoy looking at this as like the bigger picture of like what this all kind of encapsulates. So between the ages of 4 and 5, we call this the initiative versus guilt phase. The goal is I need a sense of control of my environment and purpose, which is interesting for a 4 to 5 year old to develop purpose, but this is how they do it. When I want something or want to do something, I go for it. And guess what? I may even invite others to experience leadership. In other words, like they may want to experience leadership. So when I want to do something, I may invite a friend over. So why don't we do this together? That's a form of leadership. It truly is, to reach out to someone and say, would you like to do this with me? It's a form of very primitive leadership. And so what happens is 4 to 5, you're talking even early education. Uh, we're at they're not quite at preschool, but even early learning, that sort of stage, they're trying, their social world is expanding. It's the beginning of their social world expanding. So they want to have a sense of control of their environment. Now, if they don't get it, if I go too far, I may experience disapproval, and that leads to guilt. One thing that I don't have on this webinar that I would like for you to kind of think about is this. Guilt is I have done something bad. Shame is I am a bad person. So when we're talking about guilt and shame, it's important to understand the difference there. So at this point in life, if I try to exert myself too much, if I want something so bad that, I push people down, or I make someone cry, then I may experience disapproval. People may say, that was a naughty thing that you did. And so that can lead to guilt. I did a bad thing. Shame is different. Shame is you are a bad person, and that's so much harder to deal with. When you separate the person from the behavior, that's when you can create movement. That's when it's easier to say, you did something bad, we're human, let's move on. Now, when they feel shameful, when they feel like I am a bad person, that is so much harder to work with. And it's so important for you to identify those two things when working with youth, because if they feel shame, it's a lot harder to work through shame than it is to have them forgive themselves for something they did. Because forgiving who you are is not something we do, and it's not easy to do. So that's something for you to think about as well. Here we are. The next 3 stages are in some part of adolescence, so let's get to them. Ages 5 through 12 is what we call industry. And it's industry versus inferiority. And it's between 5 and 12, and this is the goal. I need to feel like I have adapted to school and social life. Look at the age range. We're talking kindergarten to about 8th grade, maybe even 7th grade. Okay, so junior high. So I need to feel like I have adapted to school, and then school is more academic. School is when you're in elementary school, you want to feel like, oh, like I'm doing well, like this is great, my grades are fine, I'm doing okay, this is fun. Social life, again, I fit in, people like me, I think I have friends, I can call people, I can go hang out with people. So they need to feel like they have that. Now, the method that they do it is that I sense that I socially belong, and that my intelligence, my skills, or my knowledge also has meaning. So I belong in a social world, it's great, and my knowledge, who I am, what I can do for the world, has meaning. They want that feeling. And when they don't, if I don't feel that, I will feel inferior to others. I'm not good enough. If I don't have purpose or I'm not social, then I'm not as good as those people over there. And so when you are between the ages of 5 and 12, that's what you're trying to master. You're trying to master this idea that you even have one friend, or that your intelligence, your skills, or your knowledge can actually be purposeful, can actually have purpose in the world. And this is going to be important for us to talk about here in just a little bit. So remember this one, and we'll come back to it. The next one, 13 through 19, this is their identity. And what's interesting is if we do not form an identity, we confuse roles. And I'm going to explain what that means. Because if you don't have an authentic identity, you choose a role. It's like a role in a play. You choose someone else to be. And that's not your role, but you choose it because you don't know who you are. So between the ages of 13 and 19, the goal is I need to have a sense of who I am away from other people. away from people identifying who I am, away from my parents identifying who I am, away from my mentors, away from my friends. I just want to have a sense of who I am apart from everyone else. So what they do is when I act, speak, believe, think, I feel like an individual. I feel like that came from me. So I feel true to who I am. I have self-respect for who I am and love who I am. And that takes time. And I know that so many adults that I've worked with, sometimes we do have. I mean, I think I had an identity crisis about 2, 3 years ago. And so this is something that happens throughout life, is trying to, consistently create and recreate who we are every day. Now, the problem is that if they do not form that sense of who they are, then I'm going to choose someone else that other people love and respect. I do a youth workshop, a breakout session that revolves around self-image. And the interesting thing that we find is that if we do not think that the person that we are authentically is lovable, we will choose someone else who is lovable. And that's what happens. That's why it's called role confusion. If I don't think who I am is lovable, then I will choose someone else who I think is lovable. So that can think about it socially. If my friends, if my peers don't like who I am, then I'm going to adapt. I'm going to choose to do something totally different and become someone totally different, because then I'm accepted and I'm loved. So this is it's a very, I like to say that it's a very positive time for kids to find out who they are. It's also very dangerous if they get into self-harming behavior, substance abuse, those sort of things. So this is a very turbulent time for our adolescents. Now, between the ages of 20 and 39, this is where we actually seek intimacy. And if you don't, then unfortunately there's some sense of isolation. So the goal is to form intimate, loving, and romantic relationships. We do that by starting to engage in building those romantic relationships with those that I have an interest in and or an attraction to. And sometimes for individuals who do not want to build romantic relationships, sometimes it's just, you can have intimacy with a friend. You can have intimacy with family members. So we like to think of it as romantic, but at the same time, intimacy can be formed with anyone. It's just a deep level of understanding and care and mutual respect. If that doesn't happen, I will feel isolated and lonely. This is going to be important for our talk on adolescence as well here in a second, because this is huge, and I see it too often in our adolescents, especially in our teenagers, and it happens too quickly. This stage of development says that this is between 20 and 39, and I see this isolated and lonely feeling happening as early as 13. So that's why why we're going to talk about these. Now, to talk about the last two stages very quickly, between the ages of 40 and 64, we call this the generativity and stagnation stage. What that means is I need to feel like I'm working towards something meaningful and with long-lasting impact. You want purpose. You want something to look back on and say, at least I did something. At least it was, I don't know, whether it was my family, whether it was my job, whether it was a special project, whether it was traveling. I want to feel like I'm working towards something meaningful. And the way we do it is we do something with our life that fills my life with purpose. Again, this has nothing necessarily to do with jobs. You can find purpose in raising an amazing family. You can find purpose in traveling the world and doing whatever, like helping other people and doing, just, like trying to figure out what it is that fills your life with purpose, and whatever that means for you. But if you don't do it, we can feel stuck, we can feel useless, and possibly, just possibly, have a shallow bond with the world, because we start pulling away. If we don't feel like we're working towards something that has purpose and that it's not helping the world, then we'll pull away and we'll have a shallow bond with the world. I do see a question, and I'm going to come back to that after I very briefly run to the last stage, which is individuals 65 and older. And this is a stage that we call ego integrity. And if we do not have integrity, then we will despair. That's what Erickson believes. For those 65 and older, the goal is, I believe I had a purpose and I fulfilled that purpose. Simple. Looking back on life and saying to ourselves, I did something worthwhile. I lived a life that, had meaning, that um, provided my life with a sense of like, this is why I'm here. So the way we do it is we reflect on the past and feel a sense of productivity, pride, self-respect. That's how we try to do it. We try to feel all those things. I was productive. I'm proud of who I am. I'm proud of my family. I'm proud of my job, proud of my uh, philanthropy, whatever it may be. And I respected myself because of it. Now, the consequence is that we may have feelings of bitterness, regret, and despair. So that can happen. Those consequences can really come down on us. And what I want to do very quickly is kind of go on to this question that I have, which is there a possibility of failing to accomplish one stage without necessarily suffering from the consequence? So for instance, can you fail at mastering initiative without experiencing a negative response? Initiative is really about forming that social bond with people. So can you feel like you didn't master it, but you didn't necessarily, have any consequences? And my answer is sure. I would definitely say that that is possible. I don't think it's normal. As like normative. I don't think that that's the normal way that it happens in development. For instance, let's look at this one: ego, integrity, and despair. So the question being, is it possibility of failing to accomplish one stage without suffering the consequences? I look at this stage in general, just kind of as an example, and I ask myself, okay, so if I failed to feel like my life had purpose, can I live the rest of my life not feeling bitter, regretful, and despair? Sure. Do I think that people feel that though? Absolutely. So I wouldn't throw out that it's impossible, that you will always suffer the consequences. But I do believe that it is that these are normal reactions to missing a stage. So that's my response to that question. Now, this is where I need to focus on these three stages because we're talking about adolescence. We're talking about adolescent development and the adolescent brain. And so we need to talk about industry, identity, and intimacy. So here we are. These are the stages. And what I want to do is I want to reevaluate them. Industry was between 5 and 12, and that's about social and academic belonging. Identity is 13 to 19, who I am. Intimacy is 20 to 39. Now, what I'm about to do breaks laws of theories, because this was, Erickson's theory on how we develop. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a disclaimer. This is personal opinion. This is the stamp of JP has an opinion and he is putting it on a webinar. These are the stages I believe our youth are in. I think that the ages for these stages, Rhyme, are not correct. Let's look here. Again, personal opinion. I believe that for the industry phase, that goes until they're 20. Some youth are scared about choosing their life path. 10 years in working with youth, and I have seen a progressive increase of students becoming anxiety ridden because they don't know what school they want to go to or what college they want to go to. They are scared. They are so scared about choosing that because it's going to be the defining moment of my life. If I go to this college, this is what's going to have to happen. So that's that academic kind of, I have to choose my future. I have to choose my life path. That can be so scary and give them so much stress and anxiety. And the other thing that can happen is that this isn't necessarily a negative thing. It's just trying to identify that the stage happens a lot later because you have students who change schools all the time. You have students who, live in military families, who travel all over the nation, all over the world. You also have students who go out of state for college. So their social lives for some of our youth are constantly changing. My social life is constantly changing, but for youth, when it comes to development, it's a lot different because they're trying to find social belonging. And when their social world keeps changing, they have to continuously adapt. So that's what I think is so important about this stage. And I think it happens all the way to when they're 20. Here's my issue with identity. I think that yes, it can start as early as 13 for developmental reasons. I think that's absolutely true, but it goes until we're 25. And guess what? I even said some people have identity crises when they're 50. Identity crises when it's not, it doesn't just stop at 25 and we're stuck with the identity we chose. But in my opinion, because our prefrontal cortex has not fully developed, our personality can experience radical shifts even up to 25. And like I said, sometimes even later. But I watch my friends, I watch my students go through this process of trying to I mean, for those of you who are joining us live or who are watching this video, ask yourself when you felt like you had a real firm sense of what your identity is. Wherever you were in life in that moment, I've been working with youth for 10 years, and I do see students who form a strong identity, before they leave high school. And so many of them learn so much more about themselves in their 20s, and they learn about themselves and they embrace it. And so that's why I think that identity goes to 25. Here's the last one, intimacy. I think that starts at 13. Youth are engaging in relationships at younger and younger ages for a variety of different reasons, leaving some of their peers feeling disconnected and isolated at much earlier ages. The third wheel, the fifth wheel, the seventh wheel, when you have a friend that you are very close with, and all of a sudden they're in a relationship and their priorities shift. I have seen so many students and personal experience of feeling so disconnected from those friends because they were seeking intimacy at such an early age. And so I think that seeking that intimacy happens earlier, but then remember that the intimacy stage is about forming romantic relationships and that sort of connection with people. Or if you can't do that, if you don't feel like you're forming those types of relationships, those types of romantic relationships, you can feel lonely and isolated. So think about, even older middle school students and high school students engaging in these relationships, in these dating relationships, and breaking up and having this feeling of, I'm so lonely, I'm so lost, I'm so this, I'm so that. Let me sum up kind of why this whole thing is like a huge issue, especially in my opinion, why I think it's an issue. You have ever-changing social circles and academic pressures on our youth. Among teenagers who are engaging in romantic relationships and trying to balance time with friends and romantic interests and school, all while they are trying to figure out who they are in the first place. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with many youth who don't know who they are, engaging in relationships with people who don't know who they are, in a world where their future needs to be figured out now. This causes issues. And what I'm going to say is this: no, not every youth is doomed down this path. This is not, what I said here is not normal for all students. It's not, it's not a reoccurring thing, but it does happen a lot. It does happen a lot where students are becoming engaged in relationships with other individuals, and what happens is their identities become intertwined. When you don't know who you are and they don't know who they are, and you get into a relationship, you form a singular identity, and then when you break up, the identity has a hard time trying to break off into two different people, to have a sense of, I know who I am even if we break up. That's not easy. It's possible, but it's not easy, especially for a teenager and an adolescent. So what I want you to do right now is breathe. And no, seriously, your brain probably needs a second. There was a lot of information. We're not done yet. I need to just make a few connections for you, but I just want you to kind of take this in. Brain development says that, when you're trucking along and you're learning all this stuff, that you need to just every now and again take a breath, let that oxygen in, and let all that sit for a minute. So go ahead and make sure that you took a few deep breaths, and we have about 10 minutes left. So I want to make a few more connections for you to think about, and it's this. Let's connect some of the dots. So we're going to connect the dots between the brain, development, and relationships. So this is where we are. The brain, adolescents are in an emotional centered mindset. Doesn't mean that they can't think or act logically, but developmentally, they are in an emotion centered mindset. Their logical processor is not quite there. Again, this is not saying that they can't think logically, but developmentally, their prefrontal cortex is not there yet. Finally, for the brain, their decisions are primarily made off of intuition and perceived emotional experience. I'm going to do this because I'll feel good about myself. I'm going to make fun of that student because then I'm going to be seen as cool. I'm going to go volunteer my time because I'm going to feel good about myself. So they're based off of intuition and perceived emotional reaction. Like I'm going to feel good or I'm not going to feel good. And so it's very emotionally based. Now for development, students are trying to figure out who they are. They are trying to form meaningful relationships and friendships, and they are crossing several developmental stages all at the same time. They are trying to find industry while trying to find their identity, while trying to find intimacy, all at the same time. So when it comes to relationships, and I truly believe this, what we all seek as human beings, as Homo sapiens, is connection. We are a social species. We are not meant to be isolated. So when we have that, students are bombarded with media messages, social pressures, gender norms, academic expectations, etc., when it comes to relationships and identity. We no longer have, and I'm going to be very opinion based right now, kind of checking out of safe shelter time, but we live in a world of different family dynamics than we did generations ago. And our youth are using their technology and the messages in the media currently to find or identify what they think they want or need. And in my opinion, it's totally the wrong way of going about it. I think that the media nowadays is not giving them the words or the vocabulary that they need in order to find the relationships that will be meaningful, including friendships. And so they have all of this stuff coming down on them, trying to tell them what type of relationship they should look out for, who they should be, what they should be about, what they should be doing with their lives. So it's our job to help our youth process through it. And this is the reason why, is because their logical processor isn't fully functioning yet. So what I'm going to give you is just to talk through the last few bits of this is like, so then what do we do? How can we help? First thing is ask your youth questions. And if you do that already, you're doing a great job. But let me give you, like, for some examples. What do you think about your peers getting into romantic relationships? Do you see your friendships changing because they're getting into relationships? What do you think are the good things of being in a relationship? What could be the negative things? What are the good and bad things of being single? Sometimes these conversations really generate a lot of great conversation around loneliness, identity, and also just watching friendships change is when you ask them, what are the good and bad things about being in a relationship? What are the benefits and drawbacks of being single? And you'll learn so much more about your youth. And you can ask this question, who do you usually talk to about this stuff? If it's not me, I'm a youth service provider. I'm not a parent, but I've been working with parents and youth for 10 years. And even myself, as a youth service provider, I ask this question: who else do you go to talk to about this information? Who do you trust? Who do you think has the answers that you're seeking? Who can really help you think through these things? So that's a great question to ask your youth. And besides me, do you have other people? Just like I said, do you have other people you can talk to about this stuff? Other tips: pull in personal examples of when you were younger, but please don't make it about you. And I'm speaking for my youth. They do enjoy personal examples because it helps them relate to you. But when you start making it about you, they check out. And so you can say, I hear your story, and it's funny because I remember experiencing that when I was younger. Like, keep talking to me about what you're feeling, because this is interesting. So pull in personal examples, but don't make it about you and what you're going through. Now, watch out for, as we're talking about relationships and, being emotionally centered and where they are developmentally, looking for intimacy, watch out for the warning signs of potentially abusive relationships. And if you did not join us, check out the webinar on teen dating violence 101, and it's available on YouTube, and there's the link for you. But you'll want to watch out for those things, because then that is a great way to talk about their engaging in certain relationships and trying to figure out, what's the best option and direction for you. So you can start looking out for the signs that a youth may be in an abusive relationship. Now, here's the thing is I can't stress this enough. Validate their feelings. I hear that you're frustrated. I hear that you're hurt. I hear that you're annoyed with me. I hear that you're scared. I hear that you're sad. When they put a name to an emotion, they want to know they're right as a youth. And they also want to know that they're heard. So when you're talking with a youth and they get frustrated, they want you to know that they're frustrated. So to validate their feelings and say, like, I hear that you're frustrated. I'm so sorry that this is where the conversation has come to. I really hear it in your voice. It's strong. You know, can we backtrack a little bit? Can we bring it back a notch? Talk about what made us so frustrated, whatever it may be, but validate their feelings. I hear it. I hear that you're hurt. I hear that you're hurting. I hear that you're in pain. Those things, make sure that you validate their feelings. And then this is the other thing is please, please, please be mindful of where you're having your conversation with youth. And this is not for, this is for anyone, for parents, youth service providers, community members, for anyone. And I will say this bullet point is definitely for parents. Public areas may not be the best. Now, as a youth service provider, public areas are where I need to be because I am serving a youth, an underage youth. So public areas are better for youth service providers, but just remember that they may not be the best, especially as a parent. Go on a walk, go on a drive, go to a park, somewhere that's outside, but not necessarily around other people, because then that gives you a little bit of calm in your conversation, a little bit of just like an opportunity to talk without interruption, to talk without distractions. Inside places can work too. That's fine. A living room, even inside a building, inside a different building where it's quiet, totally fine. But definitely be mindful of where you're having those conversations. And just remember these things. Our youth are entitled to their feelings. And I know that, for some people that I talk to, they're like, oh, really? Are they? Are they really entitled? Yes, they are. They have feelings just like us. Their logical processor may not be fully developed, so that is our primary purpose when we're in conversation. Validate their emotions and then help them run it through logic. Don't lecture them. Let them talk for a vast majority of the time, and that's super important. They need to hear what they're thinking. You do too. So make sure that you're asking those questions. And this is the other thing. Don't tell them what to do. And, sometimes we want to go into protector mode and we want to tell them what to do and say like, if you want to avoid the consequences, do this. Okay, well, you may offer what you would do in their situation, but remind them that they have to make the decision that feels right to them, because you will not be in their life for the rest of their life. As a youth service provider, I will not be in my youth's lives, my students' lives for the rest of their life. I just won't. And what my goal is as a youth service provider, as a mentor, is to help them form critical thinking skills. When I'm not around, I want you to be able to make a decision that you think is right in that moment. So that's huge. You may offer what to do, but then say, but at the end of the day, that's your choice. And I'll be here to love on you and care about you no matter what the consequences are. But you have to make that choice in the end. So this is the point where I do answer any more questions, and it doesn't look like we have any. But here is something that I offer you, is that questions can also be asked through email, over a phone, and all that contact information is right here. And I have typical office hours. You are more than welcome to call in and ask for me. I may be out doing presentations or things like that, but I do get back to everyone who leaves me a voicemail. So I want to thank all of you for watching this video. Hopefully you learned a lot, and we will be promoting other webinars hopefully in the near future. So make sure that you continue watching out on the website for that information. And if you have anything else that you have a question about, don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you all, and I hope you have a great night.